While in Japan the cost of modernizing was high, in China the cost of not modernizing was even higher. In the port cities, the weight of Western privilege was heavy. Sikh guards of the British Army watched over Chinese prisoners. Poverty and hunger were everywhere. Modernizing China was no easy task. China had the manpower to transform the country, but China's technology was as outdated as its ruler. For decades, the Empress Dowager and her corrupt advisors had ruthlessly manipulated the Chinese government. The Empress opposed reform because it threatened her hold on power. Instead of looking to the future, she invoked a nostalgia for China's glorious past.
China intellectually was still gripped by the most unbelievably tenacious conservatism, that they could not truly acknowledge the threat they faced without simultaneously turning the entire structure of the society in a revolutionary direction.
Poverty was transforming China. But the Empress and her Manchu court ignored the hunger in the streets of Shanghai and Canton, evidence of the building discontent that would eventually erupt in revolution. They saw no reason for change, so they resisted it. It was to Japan that young Chinese reformers turned for a model of successful modernization.
Any young East Asian who hoped to develop his country, the place he went was to Tokyo to study or to Kyoto. This produces one of the great ironies, whether Japan was to lead an Asian Renaissance against Western colonialism, or whether Japan should in fact join the colonialists, join the club.
Japan soon made its choice. In Korea, the Hermit Kingdom. Under China's protection, Korea had tried to hide itself away from outside powers and the modern world. But by the 1890s, industrializing Japan wanted rice from Korea and access to Korea's markets. Just as Perry had opened up Japan, Japan confronted China over the right to open up Korea. In 1894, Japan invaded Korea and provoked a war with China. Much better trained and equipped, Japan's armies drove the Chinese out of Korea, then pushed on into Manchuria. Japan had modernized while China had not. It was a brutal difference.
Something happened to the Japanese mind in the course of this Sino-Japanese war. For centuries, Japan had looked up to China. It was the mother civilization. It was Rome and Greece combined. The Chinese had given Japan their culture, their art, their language, their literature. They respected them tremendously. But now, here they were, coming to grips with a Chinese enemy, and the enemy was weak. And they began to look on the Chinese with contempt as figures for fun or ridicule. They'd call them Changoro, Changchang, the equivalent of chinks. And suddenly, this great respect they'd had for China's age-old culture just dissolved.
The treaty which ended the war was a humiliation for China. Japan received the island of Taiwan, territory in Manchuria, and the same trading rights in China accorded the Western powers.
This was the era of imperialism, and so people thought that if Japan did not become an imperialist nation, she could not become strong and stand up to Russia or Great Britain, that she would lose her independence.
Everywhere Japan looked, the Western powers continued to flex their muscles. In colonial factories, the French tried to milk profits from cheap Vietnamese labor. And the British, French, Russians, and Americans continued to treat China as their Asian playground. China's empire was crumbling, and its neighbors moved to pick up the pieces. Russia took control of Manchuria. Japan dominated Korea. Suddenly, the largest Western nation and Asia's new military power were on the brink of territorial conflict.